Okay, so in my last video, I gave you some tips on how to write a story for a children's picture book. And I showed you how to craft that story around illustrations that you downloaded from Creative Fabrica. Now, if you haven't watched that video yet, I strongly suggest that you watch that one first, so you have a better idea of what's going on in this video. I'll put a link to that video at the end of this one. So this video is part 2 in this series, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to choose artwork from Creative Fabrica that works well together that you can use in your children's picture book. I'm also going to show you how to composite that artwork together in Photoshop so that you can create cohesive illustrations to use throughout your book. In addition to that, I'll also be giving you some tips on how to work with art from varying art styles, as well as color palettes. I'll also show you how to modify that artwork to help create a more unified appearance for your overall book. Then I'm going to finish off the video by showing you how to lay out your finished illustrations as well as your text inside of the BookBolt Studio using spreads. So if you've made it through the first video in this series and you're ready to jump in and get started designing illustrations for your children's picture book, then stick around. Hey guys, Craig here. Hope everybody's doing well. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to briefly go over all of the tools that I'm going to be using throughout this video. First, to composite the illustrations, I'll be using Photoshop. If you don't have access to Photoshop, you can just use photop.com. It's basically just a free stripped down Photoshop knockoff that you can use right inside of your browser. I'll put a link to it in the description below. Now, a little later on in the video, I'm going to be using BookBolt. For those of you who are unfamiliar with BookBolt, it's a desktop publishing software designed specifically for laying out books for KDP. All of the presets and templates are built right into the software. It also has a puzzle generator that allows you to create unique puzzles ranging from word search, crosswords, and Sudoku to the more child-themed puzzles like mazes. And all of these puzzles can be used to create activity books to sell on Amazon. And finally, it also has research tools that allow you to find profitable niches to create books for. If you're interested, I have links in the description section of this video. And if you use my promo code CraigBabin, you'll get 20% off of your subscription for life. And just know that I have quite a few tutorial videos on my channel showing you how to use every aspect of BookBolt step by step. Okay, so then the final service that I'm going to be using is Creative Fabrica. Now, Creative Fabrica is basically an image library where you can license millions of illustrations, custom fonts, and more, all of which can be used commercially in your KDP children's picture books. Again, just know that I have links for 2 exclusive offers in the description section of this video that will enable you to get either your first 10 downloads for free or get a 1-year unlimited download subscription for just $47. And as you're about to see, that subscription will save you hundreds of dollars while you're creating the illustrations for your children's picture book. That being said, let's get to it. Okay, so the first thing we need to choose is book size. So we're going to head over to KDP, and under the section on setting trim size, bleed, and margins, we're going to scroll down until we get to the tab for page size examples with and without bleed for the US. If you're watching this in Japan, use the second tab. Now all you have to do is pick out your book size. For this tutorial, I'm just going to be using an 8.5 by 8.5. Pay attention to the 2 separate dimensions given here. On the left, we have 8.5 by 8.5, which is without bleed. On the right, we have 8.625 by 8.75, which is with bleed. All KDP is doing here is adding 0.125 to each of the outside edges of the book to account for the bleed. This is where a lot of people get confused. You only add 0.125 to the outside edges of each page, not into the inside gutter edges. So your left page would have a top edge, a bottom edge, and a left outside edge. You add the 0.125 to each of those edges, not to the inside gutter edge. If you're still confused about this, I have a video that explains all of this in detail in my playlist Self-Publishing 101. Okay, now that we know our book's dimensions, it's time to set our book up inside of our desktop publishing software. Now you can use whatever software you want, but for this example, I'm going to be using BookBolt. So once you've logged into BookBolt, simply go up to the top left-hand menu and click on the Research tab. From the drop-down, choose Create and then BookBolt Studio. Now, if you've never used the Studio before, you may be asked to log in for the first time. If you have used it before, BookBolt will load your most recent project. So what you want to do from here is go up to the Project tab in the top menu, and then from the drop-down menu, choose New Project. Now, BookBolt gives you the option to create just the cover or just the interior of the book, but in this case, we're going to choose to create both at once. This is one of the benefits of using BookBolt. Next, I'm going to name the book. I'm going to choose my book's dimensions. Don't worry about the bleed dimensions. BookBolt is going to take care of all of that for you. Since I'm creating a color children's picture book, I'm going to use the premium color interior with white paper. I highly recommend this for a high quality print. Next, I'm going to select my bleed option, and finally, I'll choose my page count. Hopefully by now you'll have already written your story, so you should have a pretty good idea of what your page count is going to be. Just a little heads up. KDP will need to place a barcode on the very last page of your book interior. So if you create a 48-page book and your last page has graphics on it, KDP is going to add 4 more blank pages to the end of your book. The reason for this is because to add an additional page to a book, KDP has to add an entire spread. And a spread is made up of 4 separate pages. 2 pages on the front of the spread and 2 pages on the back. So even though they only need 1 page to place a barcode on, they will have to add 4 extra pages to your book. A simple way to avoid having extra blank pages in your book is to always leave the last page of your book blank. That way, KDP won't have to add any additional pages for their barcode. Okay, once you have your page count entered in, click the Create button. Your book is now set up and this project is saved in the BookBolt Studio. And as you can see, your book setup comes with a KDP cover template already in place. This makes it a lot easier. Again, if you're interested in a subscription to BookBolt, you can use the link as well as my promo code Babin to save yourself 20% off of the subscription price. We'll come back to the studio a little later on. Now it's time to head over to Photoshop. For those of you who don't have access to Photoshop, you can just use photopea.com. The first thing that we're going to do is create a template for our book. So why do we need a template? Because we're going to be creating all of our illustrations in Photoshop, we want to make sure that they're all sized perfectly so that we can just easily place the finished illustrations onto our pages inside of the BookBolt Studio. We don't want to be doing any editing of our illustrations in the BookBolt Studio because BookBolt doesn't have all of the tools that Photoshop does. And we're going to need a lot of those tools to make our illustrations look good. Once our illustrations are finished in Photoshop, we'll just save them out as PNGs and send them over to the BookBolt Studio so that we can start laying out our book with the text inside of the studio. Okay, so inside of Photoshop, the first thing that we want to do is click on New File. As for the setup, even though we're creating an 8.5 by 8.5 inch book, we're going to be creating our illustrations as spreads. So we're going to need a template that's the full width of our book when it's lying open. So for that reason, our width dimension will be 17 inches. Make sure that you're changing the units to inches, not pixels, or you're going to have a really small book. The height of the book can stay at 8.5 inches. The resolution will be set to 300 pixels per inch, and the color mode can stay RGB. Even though KDP prints books in CMYK, most of the images that you're going to be using from Creative Fabrica will be in RGB. So we're better off just creating an RGB and letting KDP do the conversion to CMYK at their end. They will be far better at converting all of those illustrations than you or I will be. And finally, leave the background color at white. Then just name your project to template and click the Create button. Okay, so inside of Photoshop, you should have your background layer locked out in your Layers menu. If you don't see your Layers menu, you can open it up from the Window tab in the top menu. Now the first thing that I want you to do is go up to the View tab in the top menu and make sure that Extras, Rulers, and Snaps are all turned on. You're going to need those. Next, go down to your Rectangle tool in the left-hand menu and click on it. Then go up to the top menu and make sure that the Fill is set to Transparent. Make sure the Stroke is set to Black, and then the Stroke Weight is set to 15 pixels. Then make sure that the Stroke Align is set to Inside, which is the bottom option. Now using your Rectangle tool, place your cursor at the very corner of your artboard and then drag a rectangle across your page to the exact size of your artboard. Just get as close as you can. Once you've created the rectangle, grab your Selection tool in the top left-hand toolbar and then resize the rectangle so that each side snaps to the edge of your artboard. As you're adjusting the rectangle size, make sure that you're holding down your Shift key. Doing this will allow you to adjust one side at a time without affecting any of the other sides. When it comes to moving the page around, I'm just holding down my spacebar. Once you have all of the sides snapped in, just click the little check mark in the top menu to release the rectangle from the transform mode. Now, just center your page on the artboard. Next, go over to your Layers menu and rename this rectangle to Crop and then lock it out. Now it's time to add in our bleed. So head over to the top menu and click on the Image tab. From the drop-down menu, choose Canvas Size. Inside of the pop-up menu, add 0.25 to both the width and the height dimensions. We're basically adding 0.125 to all the outside edges of our page. Then click the OK button. So this black line represents where our book is going to be cropped when it's printed. So any illustrations that are on or outside of that line will be cut off. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is put in our margins. We're going to start off by finding the center of the book. To do that, simply grab your selection tool in the top left-hand toolbar and then place your cursor over top of the left-hand ruler. Then, pressing down with your left mouse key, drag a guideline over to the center of the page. Drag it slowly and feel for the snap. When you hit the center of the page, the guideline will snap into place. You'll know your line is center when it's at the 8.625 mark. Because of the bleed, each half of our spread is 8.625 inches wide. Okay, next we're going to place our top margin, so zoom in close on the top left-hand corner. I want a margin that's 0.5 inches wide, but remember, because of the bleed, the edge of our page actually starts at 0.125. So we need to add 0.5 to 0.125, which gives us 0.625, and that's where we're going to place our top margin. Once we have the top margin placed, we'll do the same thing with the left margin. It should also be 0.625 from the side. Now the bottom edge of our page begins at 8.625. So if we subtract 0.5 from that number, our bottom guideline should be placed at 8.125. And finally, if we go over to the right side of the page, our page edge is at 17.125. If we subtract 0.5, which is the width of our margin from that number, that places our guideline at 16.625. Now when it comes to the gutter margin, I want those to be 0.75 inches. So since our center line is at 8.625, if we add 0.75 to that number, that will place our right gutter margin at 9.375. If we then subtract 0.75 from 8.625, that places our left gutter margin at 7.875. Okay, now that we have all of our margins in place, go up to the View tab in the top menu, down to the Guide tab, and from the submenu, choose Lock Guides. This will make sure that we don't accidentally move one of the guides while we're creating our illustrations. Now, just save this document out in a project folder, and then we can start bringing in some illustrations. Okay, so before we start designing our illustrations, you first need to know how to pick out the proper images for your children's storybook from Creative Fabrica. Now on Creative Fabrica, there are basically 3 different styles of art. Each style can have slight variations to it, but for the most part, all of the artwork will fall into one of these 3 categories. So the first category is 2D art. It's a very flat, cartoony style of art. More often than not, it will contain line art. In other words, there will be an outline around all of the different shapes within the image. This style of art has a very old school comic feel to it, kind of like the art you would find in the comics section of the Sunday newspaper. The second style of art is what I like to refer to as 2D polished art. It also tends to be very cartoony in nature and contains line art as well. The difference lies in the shadows and the highlights. The shadows and highlights tend to be a lot more prominent with more contrast between them. This will provide a lot more shape to the illustration. And although most of the shadows and highlights will have a feathered edge to them, the specular highlights tend to be very crisp. This makes certain parts of the illustration almost look plastic. This style of artwork became very popular around the time that Pixar's Toy Story first came out. Many artists were trying to make their 2D art look 3D. And then the final art style you'll find on Creative Fabrica is what I like to call 3D art. 3D art shares a lot of the characteristics of 2D polished art, as far as the shadows, highlights, and specular highlights go. The major difference is that the line art has been totally removed. This style of artwork tends to look more photorealistic. And when I say photorealistic, I don't mean that it looks like a real bull. I just mean that it looks like a plastic toy that you could just reach in and pick up. And there are varying degrees of 3D art. Some of it can look just like a photo. But most of what you find on Creative Fabrica will not fall into that category. The vast majority of the artwork on this website is fairly cartoony in nature. Now, no matter what your subject matter is, you'll be able to find images in pretty much all three of these art styles. Whether you're dealing with animals, human characters, or just inanimate objects like luggage, you'll be able to find artwork in all three of these styles. And the same thing holds true when it comes to background scenery. Now, I strongly suggest that you pick one art style and stick to it throughout your entire book. Although you can get away with mixing certain elements of each art style in some situations, for the most part, it's really not a good idea. Just to give you an example from my own book, I tried to mix all three art styles throughout my entire book just to see how far I could push it. And the result was not nearly as good as it would have been if I had just stuck with one single art style. So this image here has all three art styles in it. The trees in the sky in the background are 2D art, the roosters and the fence are 2D polished, and the bull is 3D. As an artist, when I look at this image, I just see a collage as opposed to one cohesive illustration. And you really want to stay away from having that patchwork appearance to your illustrations. You can get away with placing 2D polished characters on 2D backgrounds, like I did in this illustration, but I really wouldn't push it any further than that. Your illustrations will always look best if all of the elements are the same style. Okay, so now that we know what all the different art styles are, let me give you some tips on how to find the art you're looking for on Creative Fabrica. Okay, so the first thing you need to know about Creative Fabrica is that the majority of the artwork being uploaded does not utilize keywords. And what I mean by that is, normally when you're looking for something specific, you would think that it would be a good idea to use a lot of very descriptive words to narrow down your search, right? Wrong. None of the sellers use keywords on Creative Fabrica. Let me give you an example. Let's say I was looking for a funny 3D cartoon grandma. When I search that, I get 0 results. Now you might be thinking, oh my god, there are no funny 3D cartoon grandmas on this site? Actually, there are thousands of them. But the only way you're going to find them is if you generalize your search query down to just 2 words, grandma, clipart. Unfortunately, you're going to have to sort through all 3 different styles of art, but at least you'll have a wide variety to choose from. Nobody uses keywords on this site, so keep your search queries very broad. If you're looking for illustrations, always use the word clipart at the end of your query. That'll save you from having to sift through fonts, coloring pages, t-shirt templates, and other content that may be in the same theme as what you're looking for. So if you're looking for dog illustrations, type in dog clipart. Cats, cat clipart. Birds, bird clipart. You get the gist. Now let's say you come across a clipart bundle in a style that you really like. Rather than going back and continuing to search through thousands of other bundles in that category, click on the profile for the designer of that bundle. Chances are they've created a lot of additional artwork in that exact same style. And if you go through their entire profile, you may find that you can get about 50% of what you need for your book just from that one seller. And as for using general search terms, the same thing holds true when searching for objects and backgrounds for your illustrations. Just type in the word scene or background followed by the word clipart. Yes, you'll have to sort through a lot of stuff, but at least you'll have plenty of options. Okay, so that's how you find the artwork you're looking for on Creative Fabrica. Now I'm going to show you how to composite it all together inside of Photoshop. Now when it comes to designing graphics for your children's picture storybook, there are basically 4 different page layouts to choose from. The first is a partial page without bleed. The blue section in the display represents where the illustration would appear. Now this type of page layout can appear on either the left or the right side of the spread, and the text can be placed at either the top or the bottom of the page. So with this page layout, your illustrations will not be bleeding off the edge of the page. The second page layout is a full bleed page. Just as with the partial page, the full bleed page can appear on either side of the spread, and the text can be placed on either the top or the bottom of the page. This page layout is often used in conjunction with the partial page layout. Using these 2 layouts side by side just provides some design variety to your book. So it's not a bad idea to have these 2 types of page layouts make up about 70% of your book. And again, you can vary which side of the spread each one appears on throughout your book. There's no hard fast rule. The next page layout is a full bleed spread. With this layout, your illustration will cover the entire spread. And as for the text, it can appear on either the left or the right side of the spread, or both. It really depends on the illustration. You should try to incorporate at least 5 full bleed spreads throughout your book. Using a mixture of the 3 of these page layouts throughout your book will give your book a much more visually appealing look to it. Now there's one final option, and that's the storybook layout. This page layout is usually reserved for books that have a lot more words in them. So in this case, one side of the spread would have an illustration that aids in telling the story, while the illustration on the other side would simply serve as a background design for the text. But both illustrations would work together aesthetically. And just know that it doesn't matter which side of the spread that the text is on. It's entirely up to you. So what I'm going to do now is give you some tips on how to create each one of these page layouts using the exact same graphics. That way you'll be able to see that what your book ends up looking like will have less to do with the graphics you have and more to do with your layout skills. Okay, so when creating a partial page layout, try to break up your illustration into at least 3 separate graphics: your background, your midground, and your foreground character. Now what you use for your background really depends on what your midground illustration is depicting. So in this case, my midground illustration is an outdoor scene. So my background image just needs to be some sort of sky. When it comes to background colors, I just like to use watercolor splashes because I find them to be the most versatile. Yes, they can be used as a sky, but they can also represent just a basic colored wall background as well. And just know that you can always adjust the color of these swatches by simply applying a hue and saturation effect to them. In fact, if you bring the opacity of this color swatch down to about 80%, you can get some really nice effects for your background. Once you have the opacity lowered, just duplicate the layer by dragging it down to the little plus icon at the bottom of the layers menu, and then lock out the top layer and resize the bottom layer so that it's just a little bit larger than the top layer. Now just apply a hue and saturation effect to the bottom layer and change the hue to more of a pinkish color. This will create more of a dusk effect and make it look like the red setting sun is bouncing off of the clouds. And that's something you can just play around with depending on the midground graphic that you're using. So if you need your background to represent a different time of day, just know you have some options. Okay, so once you have your background in place, you can bring in your midground illustration. I try to use midground illustrations that don't already have a background baked into them. It just gives you a lot more flexibility. Now in creating a partial page layout, you want to try and keep all of your graphics inside your margins. The goal here is to leave a soft white border around your illustration. Try and center your illustration the best you can. And as for how high or low your illustration should sit on the page, depends on whether you're putting the text on top or on the bottom of the page. Now when it comes to your foreground character illustration, it should be the focal point of the page. Now this is important. When it comes to creating a partial page layout, your foreground character doesn't have to be standing on the midground illustration. In fact, it'll probably look better if it's not. You don't have a lot of control over perspective when using third-party artwork, so you kind of just have to work with what you've got. When I lay out a partial page, I like each layer, as it goes back, to be slightly higher than the previous one. And the reason for this is because my illustration is surrounded by white, and for that reason I want every element of my illustration to be touching white. This partial page layout is very similar to breaking the fourth wall in comics. I want to give the illusion that Granny is walking off the page, and I get that effect by keeping Granny's foot in the white area. And then I just raise every other image in behind her just a little bit higher. Now you can place Granny on the grass if you want to, but you'd be kind of defeating the whole purpose of creating a partial page layout. The entire purpose of this layout is to have the character seem like it's stepping out of the book. And then finally, you just add your text in right over top. I personally think that the partial page layout can add a lot of character to your children's book overall. These types of layouts just help to break up the monotony of back-to-back spreads. So as you can see, the partial page layout is just made up of 3 simple layers. On a side note, when you're choosing your graphics, try to find graphics that not only have the same art style, but that also have a similar color palette. If you have a lot of earth tones like greens and browns in your midground layer, make sure that your foreground character has some earth tones in it as well. Doing this will just make your overall illustration look a little more cohesive. Okay, so for the full bleed page layout, I'm going to use the exact same clip art. I'm just going to lay it out differently. So I'm just going to group all of the assets from this first layout together and then rename the group to partial page layout. Then I'm going to duplicate that layer by dragging it down to the little plus icon at the bottom of the layers menu. Then I'll just rename the group to full page bleed layout. So I'll start by turning everything off with the exception of the background or the sky layer. And with this layer, I'm just going to expand it so that the edges of the splash are going over the edge of my page. I'm going to resize it so that the edge of the splash is going over the top and right side of my page, as well as the center line of my spread. Don't worry about the fact that the sky is going onto the left side of the spread. I'll take care of that later on. I'm not going to worry about the bottom part of the splash going to the bottom edge of the page because that's going to be covered by grass. Now this is important. Don't expand your splash so much that the entire page is covered in blue. You want to leave a little bit of the white around the corners as well as the right edge of the page. The reason for this is because it's going to give the illusion of clouds, and that just saves you from having to put clouds into your background. That being said, even if your background layer isn't supposed to be a sky, like let's say it's supposed to be a wall, you can still leave a little bit of the white on the page just to keep your background from looking like a solid bucket fill. Okay, so when it comes to the midground layer, you want to expand it to the point where both the left and the right grassy areas are going over the center line as well as the right edge of the page. Remember, this is going to be a full bleed page, so you don't want there to be any white areas around the grass section. I'm going to place this midground as close to the bottom of the page as I can. Now you'll notice that I still have some white area around the bottom, and I don't want that. All I'm going to do to get rid of it is just duplicate the midground layer by dragging it to the plus icon at the bottom of the layer menu, and then I'm going to right click on the copy layer and I'm going to rasterize it. I'm also going to rasterize the original layer as well. This will allow me to erase portions of these layers. A lot of times when you bring artwork from Creative Fabrica into Photoshop, it won't be rasterized, so you won't be able to edit it. All you have to do is right click on it and choose rasterize and you'll be good to go. Now I'm going to lock out the original layer and make sure that the copy layer is below the original. Next, I'm going to turn off the original layer, and then using my marquee selection tool, I'm going to select the entire top part of the illustration all the way down to the grassy area. Then I'm just going to hit my delete key. All I want remaining of this copy layer is just the grassy area. Once I have everything else removed, I'm going to turn the original layer back on and then just resize the copy grassy area so that it fills up all of that white space at the bottom of the illustration. Now, because of the way this grassy area is drawn so messy, I don't really have to do anything other than resize this. No one is really going to notice that this is two separate layers on top of one another. And keep in mind, all of the grassy area that's outside of this black crop line is going to be cut off the book, so it's not going to be showing up anyway. You just want to resize the underlying grassy area to the point where you don't see any repeating patterns in the grass. Now sometimes when you're using clip art, there'll be a little bit of a white edge around the art. All you need to do to get rid of that is unlock the layer with the white edge, right-click directly on the layer icon and choose Select Pixels. This will select the entire outside of your clip art. Next, with the clip art selected, go up to the Select tab and from the drop-down, choose Modify and Contract. Contract it about 2 pixels. Then go back up to the Select tab and from the drop-down menu, choose Inverse. By doing this, you're now selecting all of the area outside of the selection instead of inside. Now just hit your delete key. All of that white outline should be gone. If you still see some of it there, just repeat those last few steps one more time. Now if you want to go and erase some of this top grassy area to make it look a little better, you can. It's entirely up to you. Once you have everything looking the way you want it, you can select both of these midground layers and then right click on them and merge them into one layer. Now you've probably noticed that some of the artwork is overlapping your center line. All you have to do is grab your rectangle selection tool, drag it out so that it covers the inside half of your left page, and bring it right up to the center line. Then selecting your background layer, hit the delete key. With the page still selected, select your midground layer and then once again hit your delete key. That will remove any artwork overlapping your center line. Now the last thing you're going to need to do is resize your foreground character layer. So unlike the partial page layout, in this one, Granny is going to be standing on the grass. You really want your character to take up quite a bit of this page, so make it fairly large. Now there is going to be one area that may look a little off, and that's where the foreground character actually comes in contact with the midground layer. An example of that is right here by Granny's foot. There's a nice dark area of grass under her foot, but there are also lighter colored blades of grass going under her foot as well, and they shouldn't be. They should be in front of her foot. To rectify this, just select the character layer and then reduce the opacity to about 30%. Then just zoom into that area of the foot and using your eraser tool, make sure that it's set to hard and 100% opacity. Then just erase the part of the foot that's covering the blades of grass. Once you have that erased, go and put the opacity of your character layer back to 100%. And as you can see, the blades of grass now appear to be in front of the shoe instead of underneath it. Doing this will tie the character into the environment a little better. And this isn't something you can only do with grass. You can do this with sand, stone, snow, or any other element. The whole point of this is to make the midground illustration appear to be both behind as well as in front of the foreground character illustration. By erasing some of the foreground clip art, you give the illusion that some of the midground clip art is actually in front of it. Okay, and as far as the text is concerned, it can pretty much just stay where it is. Now, if we go back and we compare the two different layouts, you can see that even though both are made up of the exact same graphics, they have an entirely different feel to them. Okay, let's move on to the third layout option. Now, since I cropped some of the clip art in the full page bleed layout, I'm going to duplicate the partial page layout one more time. That way I'll have the full illustrations to work with. So I'm just going to drag the partial page layer down to the little plus icon at the bottom of the layers menu to duplicate it. I'll make sure that it's on top of the other two layers, and I'm going to rename it to full bleed spread layout. Okay, so inside of this group, I'm going to turn off everything except for the background sky clip art. I'm also going to duplicate this sky clip art the same way I duplicated the group layer. Because I need to cover a full spread, I'm going to need 2 paint splashes. On a side note, always keep in mind that you can only expand a piece of clip art so much before it starts to look really pixelated. Most of the artwork that you'll be downloading from Creative Fabrica will be fairly large, so it shouldn't be a problem. So with these paint splashes, I'm going to resize them to the point where they're taking up about 90% of the page. Once again, this is going to be a full bleed page, so I want the edge of the paint splashes to go over the edges of my book. With the second instance of my paint splash, I'm just going to slightly overlap the first splash, and I'm also going to make it slightly larger than the first splash. I'm doing this to try and remove any uniformity or pattern on the page. Again, leave a little bit of the white area around the edges to give that cloud effect. Once you have your background layer the way you want it, you can select both of these paint splashes in the layer menu, right-click on them and merge them. Then just lock out the layer. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to work on is the fence in my midground layer. I'm going to resize this piece of clip art a little bit larger than it was in the full bleed page layout. The reason for that is because I'm not going to be using the full illustration in this layout. I'm only going to be using the top half. I'm also going to create a second instance of this clip art by dragging the layer down to the little plus icon at the bottom of the layers menu. I'm going to place the first instance down in the right-hand corner of the spread, kind of like so. I want to make sure that the water barrel is not showing on the page. Now, as for the second instance, what I'm trying to achieve here is to make it look like Granny is walking through an opening in the fence. So I'm going to place this second instance of the fence in the bottom left-hand corner of the spread, almost to the point where 90% of it is off the page. I just want to show enough of the fence to give the illusion of 2 gate posts. Okay, now this is important. You don't always have to use the entire piece of clip art in your design. As you'll see in a minute, I sometimes choose clip art solely because there is a section of the clip art that I want in my illustration. So when you're choosing clip art from Creative Fabrica, don't reject a piece of clip art simply because you can't see a way to fit the entire image into your design. If there's only a small section of the clip art that will work in your design, use it and just leave the rest of the image hanging off of your page. Now that I have my midground layers in place, I'm going to bring in my character foreground layer. Now, if I go back to my first 2 layouts, you'll notice that the perspective that this Granny character is drawn in is as if the camera was sitting at around her nose level and is slightly pointed downward. So we're kind of looking down on Granny. And what gives the illusion that we're looking down on her is the fact that we can see the top of her back foot. So in this layout, I want to move that camera so that it's slightly lower than Granny's chin, and I want it to be pointing upward so that we're looking up at Granny. To achieve this, I need to hide that back foot. So I'm going to make sure that it's not on the page at all. And I'm also going to make Granny very large so that she takes up pretty much all of the space between the 2 fence posts. Now that we can only see the bottom of her front foot, it creates the illusion that the camera is actually looking slightly up at her. Okay, so now that I've used all of my clip art, I'm going to place in my text. Now because I have so much space on the right side of the spread, In a situation like this, I would probably just add in another line of text just to fill in some of that space. Now, when you're creating a design like this, the whole goal is to create the illusion that the environment is much bigger than what we're just seeing on the page. And that's one of the reasons that I have the fence running off both sides of the spread. That leads the viewer's mind into thinking that the fence continues on far outside of the camera lens. And the way you achieve that illusion is to place partial images on the edges of the pages. In illustration, this is sometimes referred to as framing the picture. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create the illusion that there's an entire backyard that's just outside of the camera's view. And I'm going to do that by placing trees around the outer edges of my design. So I'm just going to use this tree bundle that I downloaded from Creative Fabrica. Take notice that the illustration style of these trees is very similar to the illustration style of the grass in the other layouts, and that the color palette is pretty close as well. When you're adding in framing for your design, you want to make sure that you're staying consistent with the drawing style as well as the color palette. Okay, so using my lasso tool, I'm just going to select the top portion of one of these trees from this file, and then I'm going to copy it. Once it's copied, I'll go back to my spread and paste the image, and I'm going to place it just below my fence layers. Now I'm going to resize this image and place it so that about 1/3 of it is showing up on my page. You'll notice that in this design I'm creating, we can't see the ground, the bottom of the fence, or Granny's back foot. So that gives the illusion that the ground is well below the camera's view. For that reason, I'm not going to show the bottom portion of this tree. I want to create the illusion that this tree is off in the distance a little bit, and that we're only seeing the top of it. Now, I'm going to do the same thing using a different tree on the other side of the spread. Again, I'm not going to show the entire tree. I'm only going to show the top of it to create the illusion that it's off in the distance a little. So you can see why they call this framing the picture. I'm basically adding a border around the edge of my page. Now the next thing I want to do is create the illusion that this yard is really big. And to do that, I need to make it look like there's a lot of space between the fence and whatever's at the very back of the yard. So I'm going to grab another tree from that bundle and I'm going to paste it in behind my tree on the right hand side of my spread. Only this time, I'm only going to show the very top of the tree and I'm going to lower it to the very bottom of the page. I just want a few leaves peeking out over top of the rail of the fence. Now you'll notice that these two trees have almost the exact same tone to them, which makes it look like they're almost side by side to one another, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is select the layer that my front tree is on, and I'm going to apply a levels adjustment to it. If you don't see the adjustment tab in your right hand toolbar, you can open it up from the window tab in the top menu. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this levels adjustment is I'm just going to lower the medium slider to about 0.75. Now when I do that, everything in the scene that is below that level adjustment layer is going to get darker, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select that level adjustment layer along with the layer of the front tree that's directly below it, and I'm going to right click on them and merge them together. Doing this will confine the level adjustment effect to only the front tree. When I merge them, you'll notice that all of the stuff in the background has brightened up again. Now I want you to look at this bottom right hand corner section. Because our camera angle is looking upwards, and because this front flower and this front tree both have a lot of shadow on them, it makes the front tree appear closer to the fence. But because we're only seeing the very top of the tree in the back, and because it's much brighter, it's creating the illusion that that tree is way off in the distance, sitting directly in the sunlight. By creating contrast between the front tree and the back tree, I'm creating the illusion that there's a lot of space between the fence and that back tree. This is how you add depth to your design. Now just to balance the spread out, I'm going to add a second background tree to the left side of the spread as well. But because it's so small, I'm not going to worry about darkening up the front tree. Okay, now that I have my basic scene framed and the yard looks fairly expansive, my design is almost done. There is one more thing that I'm not happy with though. Because my character foreground is so large on the left side of the spread, the area below my text looks a little empty. Now I could add another line of text there, but I don't really want to do that. I could also just add the silhouette of a bird way off in the distance to the sky area, and that would fill in some of the space. But rather than do that, I'm just going to add a secondary foreground character that adds a little more humor to the scene. So I'm going to place this little ladybug character that I downloaded from Creative Fabrica right here on the fence. It doesn't take away from the focal point of the design, which is Granny, but it does add a little more character to the overall scene. So all you're doing when you're designing a spread for your children's picture book is layering different pieces of clip art that have a similar art style as well as a similar color palette in a manner that creates a cohesive composition that has depth to it. And you create that depth by framing your design using clip art that provides contrast between the layers in front and the layers in behind. So when you're choosing clip art from Creative Fabrica, you need to go in with the mindset, is this a good foreground image, a midground image, or a background image? And you may have to ask yourself, which part of the image can I use? More often than not, you won't need the entire image in your design. And keep in mind, I'm creating an outdoor yard scene, but I can create any scene using this layering technique. It's all about layering the clip art to add depth to the design. Okay, so now I'm going to give you one more example, and this one will be on how to create a spread for a longer children's storybook. So that's one that has more than 4,000 words in it. I'm also going to be using different clip art this time. So I'm just going to lock out this layer and turn it off. Okay, let's say you're creating a children's storybook that also has illustrations in it. In most cases, you're probably going to have dedicated at least one of the pages from each spread to text, meaning that text is going to be the focal point of that page, as opposed to a character or artwork. Now there are a few different ways that you can go about doing this. You can dedicate the left side of each spread to text throughout your entire book, or the right side. Or you can alternate from side to side with every spread. How you choose to do this is entirely up to you. For this example, I'm just going to keep the text on the left side. So it's going to be important when designing your spread that you don't put any artwork that you want to be seen or that's important in the telling of the story under the text. A lot of these types of storybooks will limit the illustrations to just one side of the spread. So let's start off by creating our illustration on the right side of the spread. So the first thing I'm going to do is lay down my background image. Now when you're dealing with AI generated artwork, most of that type of art is created in the RGB color mode and is meant purely for digital purposes. As a result, this illustration here has a lot of really dark shadows in it. And although it looks fantastic on the computer screen, when it's printed out on paper, it's going to be extremely dark. So one of the things that you might want to do when creating your design is lighten up the shadows on the artwork just a touch. The best way to do this is just to select the layer that the artwork is on, and then go up to the Image tab in the top menu, down to Adjustments, and then choose Shadows and Highlights from the submenu. As you can see, by raising the shadows up about 35%, I can really lighten that image up quite a bit. And I'm not washing the image out with white like I would be if I was using a brightness effect. I'm simply lightening those really dark shadows. If you find that your image is looking a little too bright, you can also darken some of the highlights as well by simply raising the highlight percentage. What you're basically doing here is flattening out the image. You're removing a lot of the deep tones and bringing more color to the image. The light version of this image is going to look way better in print than the dark version would. Just don't overdo it. Okay, let's add in our character foreground image. Now I know some of you are going to ask, what if I find an image on Creative Fabrica that is already finished, meaning that it has a background, a midground, and a character foreground illustration already composited together in one complete image? Can't I just use that image? The short answer is, yes, you can, but I wouldn't. If you don't alter the images you download from Creative Fabrica in any way, then there is always the chance that someone else will have already used that exact same image in their children's book. And if that happens and Amazon sees it, there's a good chance that they may deem that use of the image as being duplicate content. And using duplicate content is strictly forbidden in Amazon's terms of service. Never under any circumstance should you ever use a piece of clip art from Creative Fabrica solely as is. Always modify it as much as you can by adding additional clip art to it. Every piece of clip art that you download should only make up a part of your overall design. It should never be the entire design, even in a children's picture book. Now I've heard people say, yeah, well I would agree with that statement if you're creating a t-shirt or a mug or something that has a one-off design on it, but a children's picture book has dozens of illustrations in it. It doesn't matter, the same rules apply. Your goal when creating your children's picture book is to make every illustration as unique as possible to prevent copyright claims from arising. Do you have the legal rights to use the illustrations that you download from Creative Fabrica in your commercial projects? Yes, absolutely. But there is no way to know for sure whether or not the seller who generated the image came up with the idea from the top of their head or whether they directly copied the illustration from another artist on another platform. For that reason, you should never use any image as a standalone image inside of your book. You should always try to modify your images as much as possible. Always create unique designs by layering multiple images together to create a new cohesive illustration. Now, a lot of times when you're searching for clip art, you may come across an image and think to yourself, this one's not going to work. The background image has a wood floor and this granny character is on a stone floor. Well, I guess I could erase all of the stone from the character image, but there's a lot of shadows coming off of all of these objects, and trying to get them to look like they're actually on the wood floor is going to be a real nightmare. As I said earlier in the video, you don't always have to use the entire image. Just use the part of the image that you need. By not using any of the stone floor in my design, I can tie this character directly into the background image with almost no modification. Now you can see just looking at the two pieces of clip art that they are both lit quite differently. The background image is using more warm lighting with yellowish hues, and the foreground character is pretty much using straight white light. This is too much of a contrast, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that same shadows and highlights effect one more time. Only this time, I'm just going to lighten the shadows a touch, but I'm also going to darken the highlights quite a bit. You can see if I turn this effect on and off, what a difference it makes. Now, although it does look a lot better, I can go one step further. If you look at the background image, you'll notice that there are a lot of warm light sources. From the flames on the candles to the string of lights, there is a lot of warm light emanating from this scene. But if you look at the granny character, even though I lowered the highlights quite a bit, she's still predominantly lit using white light. So what I want to do is add some of that warm yellow light to her. To do that, I'm going to create a new layer just by clicking on the little plus icon at the bottom of the page. Then I'm going to right click on the icon of my granny layer, and from the pop-up menu, I'm going to choose Select Pixels. And this will outline my granny character to prevent me from drawing on the background image. With my character still selected, I'm going to go back up and select that new layer that I just created. I'm also going to change the mode to Overlay. Next, I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool, and in the top menu, I'm going to make sure that my brush is set to soft and that my opacity is set to around 30%, and then that my flow is set to about 40%. Then I'm going to change the color of my paintbrush to a warm dark yellow. I'm going to increase my brush size a bit by using my bracket keys. And then I'm just going to paint on some warm highlights over all of the white areas on Granny. So that would include her hair and face, her headscarf, her hands, the top of the pumpkin, as well as this little Pikachu character. Now if you find the warm glow to be a little bright, just lower the opacity of this layer by about 20 or 30%. You can see if I turn this layer on and off that by adding just this little bit of color creates a nice warm glow on the character and ties it into the scene a lot better. And when you're placing your foreground character on the page, don't be afraid to let it overlap the opposite page. Doing this not only provides a little more character to the spread, but it also helps to tie in the opposite page to the overall composition. Now this is where 90% of the AI generated children's books stop. Do not do this, it is so lazy. A clear sign that a book was designed by an amateur is when it's left like this. Amazon is flooded with books just like this, and most of them are not selling. Why? Because they look like they're rushed and unfinished. When it comes to creating children's picture storybooks, it's not about putting out as many books as you can. It's about creating a few really good books. It's far better to spend 3 months creating one really good book than to spend 1 month creating 3 crappy books. And this statement is even more applicable if you don't have a lot of design skills. If you're a really good graphic designer and you can hammer out a book in under a month, then fine. But if you're not a good graphic designer, then slow down and take your time. Now remember how I said that you don't need to use an entire image? Watch what happens when I just add the back wall portion of this image to my text page. Because this wall has the same warm colors and a really nice texture to it, it ties this text page right into the illustration page. Doing this alone would be a huge improvement, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to add in a little fall themed decoration in 2 of the empty corners of this page as a way to tie in the illustration page. Now whenever you're going to use decorative accents, you always want to make sure that they consist of something that is already in your illustration. So in this case, I could use decorative accents that consist of autumn leaves, or pumpkins, or maybe even candles. As long as the action in some way ties into the theme of the original illustration, you can use it. Now, because I want to fill in some of these empty corners, I'm going to specifically look for corner decorations. So when you're searching for images on Creative Fabrica, you just want to type in something that defines your theme, followed by the words corner clip art. So if I needed Christmas themed decorations, I would just type in Christmas corner clip art. And that search would bring up all kinds of bundles that I could use as corner decorations for my Christmas themed book. You could also type in something like holly clip art, and that would also bring up all kinds of clip art that you could use to decorate the corners of your spread. Now, because my illustration has autumn leaves in it, I'm just going to search for an autumn leaves bundle. And something like this would be perfect. So back in Photoshop, I'm just going to open up the corner decoration file, copy it using my rectangle selection tool, and then paste it on my spread. Next, I'm going to resize it a bit and then position it in the top left-hand corner of my page. Once I've got it where I want it, I'm going to make a copy of this layer. Then I'm going to lock out the original layer and then drag the copy down to the bottom right-hand corner of the page. With it selected, I'm going to go up to the Edit tab, down to Transform, and from the submenu, I'm going to choose Flip Horizontally. Then I'm going to go back up to the Edit tab one more time, down to Transform, and this time I'm going to choose Rotate 90 degrees clockwise. Then I'm just going to place my corner decoration right where I want it. I think I'm going to add some effects to these decorations, so to save myself some time, I'm just going to select these two layers, right-click on them, and choose Merge. Looking at the leaves on top of the pumpkin, they have a little too much white light on them. So I'm going to apply that same shadows and highlights effect that I used earlier, only this time I'm going to keep the shadows set to 0, and I'm just going to bring down the highlights by about 5%. As you can see, when I turn this effect off and on, it adds just a little bit more warm light to the leaves. Now, because the illustration side of this spread is in a 3D art style, there are quite a few shadows in it. So to tie in my text page a little better, I'm going to add a very subtle drop shadow to the leaves. And I can do that by selecting the layer and then going down to the Effects button at the bottom of the Layer menu, and then from the submenu, choose Drop Shadow. I want a very subtle shadow, so for the color, I'm going to sample some of the brown area of the wall, and then I'm just going to go a bit darker. I'm going to leave the blend mode at normal and set the opacity to around 18%. I'll put the distance up to about 8 pixels and the size to about 45 pixels. And if I turn the preview on and off, you can see that the shadow just adds a little bit of depth to the clip art. So now if I turn the corner and background layers off, you can see how much of a difference just these two little graphics add to the overall appearance of this spread. It doesn't take a lot of work to make something look more professional. It just takes a little creativity and some imagination. Now when it comes to saving out your finished spreads, you first want to make sure that that crop line we created in the beginning is turned off. You also want to turn off your text layer. Your text should always be added to your book inside of whichever desktop publishing software that you're using to lay out your book. So if you're using Adobe InDesign, add in your text in that software. If you're using BookBolt, add the text in there. The reason for this is because you're going to be saving these spreads out as PNGs, and when you save something out as a PNG, everything on that page will be rasterized, which means when you bring the image into BookBolt or InDesign, you won't be able to edit the text anymore. Out of anything else in your book, the text is going to be the one thing that you may have to make edits to after printing the book. You may make a spelling mistake, or you may find that the text is a little too large for the final print. You don't want to have to go back into Photoshop, change every single one of those spreads one by one, re-export them all out, re-upload them all to your desktop publishing software, and then create a new PDF. You will save yourself a ton of time if you can fix all of those text problems right inside of your desktop publishing software all at once. Plus, editable vector text always looks crisper and cleaner than rasterized text when printed. So make sure that you turn that text layer off. Don't worry about those margin guides. They won't show up in the PNG. So all you have to do is go up to the File tab in the top menu, down to Export, and then just choose Quick Export as PNG. That will give you a high quality image to place inside of your book. Now there's one more thing that I want to show you. If you use Adobe InDesign to lay out your book, importing these spreads is really quite simple because InDesign lays out books using spreads. So all you have to do is find the spread that you want to add your illustration to, Choose the layer that you want the illustration to be on, and then go up to the File tab in the top menu, down to Place, choose your image, and then simply line your cursor up to the very top left-hand corner of your spread, right on top of the bleed line. Then just drag it out. InDesign by default is set to a typical performance, but if you want to see what your image looks like unpixelated, just right-click on the image, and from the pop-up menu, choose Display Performance, and then choose High Quality Display. As for the text layer, you just grab the text tool, drag out a text box, and then just copy and paste your text in from Photoshop. You may have to change the font style and size, but doing that is exactly the same as it is in Photoshop. And there you go, your finished spread is in your book. All you have to do now is just create and bring in the rest of your spreads. Now for those of you who are using BookBolt to lay out your book, the process is slightly different. BookBolt doesn't lay out in spreads like InDesign, it lays out in single pages. So what you need to do is find the left page of your spread. Now BookBolt always places the cover first. The next page is a single page. It will be the first page of your book. Then every 2 consecutive pages after that will be spreads. So page 2 and 3 will be a spread. Page 4 and 5 will be a spread, and so on. Before we go any further, go up to the Settings tab in the top menu, and from the pop-up menu, choose the tab Guides and Grid. From there, make sure that the object snap is turned on and that the page edges and Amazon KDP margins are both visible. You're going to need these to align your images properly. Then just click the Save button. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to want to do is click on the File Library icon in the left-hand menu. And then from the pop-up menu, upload your finished spread image from your computer. Once it's finished uploading, just click on it to load it to your page. Now what you want to do is grab either the top or bottom corner of the image and scale it up until both the top of the image and the bottom of the image are touching the top and bottom edges of your page. Next, you just want to drag this image over to the right until the center of the image snaps to the right edge of your page. If you've sized this image properly, the left side of your image should be lined up perfectly with the left side of your page. Now just click on the image and choose Copy. Then lock out this layer on the Layers menu. Next, make sure the page is saved out and then go down and select the next page from the left-hand page menu. Right-click on the page and choose Paste. Now just drag the image over to the left until the center of the image is snapping to the left edge of your page. Also make sure that the top and bottom edges of your image are aligned perfectly to the top and bottom of your page as well. Once your image is in place, go over to the Layer menu and lock out this layer. Then save out this page. Okay, now if you go up to the little eye icon in the top menu and you click on it, it's going to open up a preview menu. Click on the Book View tab in the top of the menu, and then using the Next button at the bottom of the page, find your spread. Your 2 images should pretty much be aligned. You may have to finesse your images a little bit if your spread isn't lining up. And this sometimes happens when your images are not actually lined up to all of the sides of your page on your artboard. If after adjusting your images there's still a little minor offset, don't worry about it. Most of this middle area is going to be in the gutter of the book anyways, so no one will see it. Now you can just close down that preview menu and go back to your pages. Okay, so the last thing we have to do is add in your text. So head over to the page where you want to place your text. Select the text icon in the left-hand menu, and then from the side menu, choose Add Multi-Line Text. From the top menu, start by choosing the alignment that you want for your text, and then choose the font style you want to use. If you don't see the font that you want to use in the free fonts, then you can always upload the font that you want to use from your computer. I'm just going to use Amaranth for this example. Then just copy the text from your Photoshop working file and paste it into BookBolt. Now just resize the window and drag the text box, making sure to snap it to the center of the page. And if you want to adjust the line height and character spacing, you can do so from here. Once you have your text placed properly, lock out the text layer and then double check the appearance up in the Book View tab. And that's basically all there is to laying out your spreads in BookBolt. It's pretty much the same as doing it in InDesign with just a few extra steps. Once you have your entire interior and cover laid out, just go up to the Download tab in the top menu and choose Download Current Project in either CMYK or RGB, depending on what you're creating the book for. So as you can see, it doesn't really take that much extra work to create a professional looking spread. If you just take your time and use your imagination, you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish. Now remember, if you want to save yourself some extra money on subscriptions to either Creative Fabrica or Bookbolt, I have links to exclusive offers in the description section of this video. And if you haven't watched part 1 of this series, which is on how to write a children's storybook, you can find a link to that video right here. You can also find a link to my entire self-publishing 101 playlist just above that. Until next time, take care.